Hey guys, my name is Naguura and today I'm going to be telling you everything that you need to know about Covenant abilities for Moonkins. So first of all, let me tell you that while I'm recording this, it is 9.0.1. So we are still in beta, there's still lots of things that can be changed. If there's going to be any minor changes to the ranking or to the abilities of the Covenant abilities for Moonkins, I'm going to be writing it in the description below. If there's going to be any major changes to the ranking or to the abilities, I will probably be making a new video, so keep an eye out for that. Alright, let's go straight into the ranking. For now, as it stands, for DPS as a Moonkin, their ranking is as follows. Number 1, Venthyr. Number 2, Nightfey, not too far behind when it comes to single target damage. Number 3, Kyrian, and number 4, Necrolord. Now, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons a little bit. Let's start with our best Covenant so far, Venthyr. Venthyr gives you the Ravenous Frenzy ability as a Moonkin, which is a 3-minute cooldown that buffs you for 20 seconds on use. So every druid spell you cast increases your damage, healing, and haste by 2%, and this effect stacks. So it is really nice to use with your Incarnation or Celestial Alignment because it's also a 3-minute cooldown, but it really feels like an ability that does not do much. It just does not feel as impactful because you just macro it into your 3-minute cooldowns, and it gives you damage and haste per stack, and it does ramp up, but it's just is not a feel-good ability just because it's just something that you use with your other cooldowns anyway. Now, the pros of it is it does do the most overall DPS. It is pretty versatile, so it is good for single target and for AoE, and no matter what situation you're in, this is going to be a good ability. And it also gives you a pretty good burst window during your Incarnation during this Ravenous Frenzy up. Now, the cons of this ability, though, is the downside of the ability, of course, which I think it might be one of the only Covenant abilities that do have a downside. The downside is if you idle for 1.5 seconds, you will get stunned, you suffer 3% of your HP per stack in damage, and the effect ends. Now, this, of course, can be played around. Idling means that you're not casting anything for 1.5 seconds. Moving does not count as not idling. So just moving alone will not be good enough. You just need to make sure that you're casting abilities, but even something like Dispel, Shapeshifting will count. If you're stunned, feared, knocked, or anything like that, disoriented, then the effect will pause and you will not get stunned or the effect will not get removed. So that is definitely something that people were concerned about in PvP, but they did make it so it actually is paused and you will not lose the effect once you're stunned. The other downsides are that there's going to be too much emphasis on our 3-minute cooldown, which is already a pretty big problem for Moonkins because we have a much longer cooldown than most other classes do. So having most of your damage come every 3 minutes and then in between your 3 minutes you feel really weak is definitely causing some issues, especially in M+, and in a raiding environment where you need damage more often than once every 3 minutes. The other downside is that it causes a pretty boring playstyle as it stands right now, because as I said, this ability doesn't really add anything to our rotation, because it just makes our cooldown stronger, and because of the way Ravenous Frenzy works with the stacks, we're going to be having a pretty boring playstyle where we just stand still and having to cast a lot of fillers in a row, like Solar Wrath, Solar Wrath, Solar Wrath, Solar Wrath, or Starfire, the other way around if you're AoEing. This could be fixed by a Moonkin design issue, though. Doesn't necessarily have to be the Ravenous Frenzy's fault. Now, moving on to Nightfey. Nightfey is our second best Covenant DPS-wise. It is not too far behind compared to Venthyr, at least for single target. So lots of Moonkins love this Covenant ability and love this Covenant in general. They think it really fits the Moonkin style. So I definitely would say that if you want to play Nightfey and you really don't want to play Venthyr at all, then I would say, as it stands right now, that you could be picking Nightfey as well, and it would not be an insanely big difference in DPS. Now, Convoke the Spirit is a Covenant ability for druids, What it does for Moonkin is that it will cast 12 druid spells over 4 seconds, and it's a 2-minute CD. I currently cast 13 spells, but I believe that is a bug. It's supposed to cast 12 spells. Now, the pros of this ability is that it feels really good to use. You press the button and you're shooting out lots of abilities, and it just feels nice. It also has a really big burst window for a single target, which also feels really good. And it can also be used for utility, for example, for off healing. For example, if you're in a plus environment, your healer dies, then you could be using your Convoke in your caster form instead of your Moonkin form, and it will cast a lot of healing abilities instead of Moonkin abilities. Now, the cons of this ability is that it's a 2-minute cooldown, which really doesn't align well with our incarnation, so it can cause some situations that don't feel good. The targets are chosen randomly by this ability, so that means if there's lower priority targets, immune targets, or any sort of priority damage that you need to do, then this ability is not good for it. And the other problem is that it does less damage if you're in melee range, or if there's a lot of members of your group or raid that are injured. Because if you're in melee range, it will use a bunch of abilities that are feral abilities, while if you're in ranged, it will not use those abilities, and it uses Moonkin abilities instead, which does a lot more damage, of course. And also, of course, if you're wasting abilities on healing abilities because people are injured, then they will also end up in a damage loss compared to if everyone would be full HP. The other problem is it doesn't scale as well with AoE because of the issue that Starfall does not stack. So it will cast one Starfall and then shoot out a bunch of Star Surges, which is good, but definitely not doesn't scale as well with AoE as, for example, the Venthyr ability would. Now, to our third best Covenant, Kyrian. Kyrian has the druid ability Kindred Spirit. Kindred Spirit makes you be able to bond another player, and every 1 minute you can empower this bond, granting 30% of your damage as additional arcane damage, healing, or absorb to each other. Now, the pros of this ability is that it's pretty versatile in strength. So no matter what situation you are, no matter if you're in an AoE situation, 1 target, 3 targets, 5 targets, it can always be good, theoretically. Then it has a low cooldown, which means you don't have this downside of being really dependent on a really long cooldown. And it can also be used for healing or survivability if need be. The cons of this ability is that it's really complicated to use, and you're very dependent on your partner. So you need to find a player that does a lot of damage. Probably you're just going to be picking the player who does the most damage in your raid or group, and you're really reliant on this person to do as much damage as they can during that 10-second window. Again, it requires really good communication with that person too. If you're pugging and you're just buffing a random person and that person is not aware that they're being empowered right now, then they might not be doing the most optimal damage within those 10 seconds, and therefore you might be losing, or you might not be getting as much damage from that person as you could. And on top of that, it also has a GCD, which feels bad because it's just a buff, and it also only lasts 10 seconds, so having a GCD on an ability like that just does not feel good. And of course, it also loses a lot of value if there's no one else that you can bond with. If you're by yourself, if you're doing solo content, then you can still empower the ability, but you will only get a 10% damage increase by default if you don't have anyone else to bond. Right, our fourth best Covenant is Necrolord, which gives us Adaptive Swarm. It's a 25 seconds CD, and it commands a swarm that heals or deals shadow damage over 12 seconds to a target, increases the effectiveness of your periodic effects and on them for 20 seconds. So when it expires, it can jump to friendly targets and then back to enemy targets, and it will jump up to 3 times. And since it only has a 25 seconds CD, that means that you could have 2 dots up at the same time, max. Now, the pros of this is that it makes you feel more like a dot class, and it has a low CD. But unfortunately, our dots are pretty bad damage-wise, so buffing them is not really, like, buffing something that does 0 damage by 100% still ends up being 0, so a buff on it is just not very good, even though it also buffs Fury of Elune and Starfall, even though they're not considered dots, but for this effect they actually are affected by this 20% buff too. But that's still not good enough, and it's just really, it's just not good for us compared to how good it is for Feral, for example. And it creates this issue that since Ferals do have the same ability, if they buff it for Moonkins, then it will obviously also buff it for Ferals and make it OP for Ferals. So I feel like Necrolord is just always going to be a bad ability for Moonkins because we also have Ferals in our as a druid class, and therefore just making this really, really hard to balance. Then another con is that it doesn't scale with more than 2 targets because you can only have 2 up at a time. So whenever there's any sort of AoE, it will not scale with more than 2. And of course, it's also RNG on which targets are getting affected by this, that once it starts jumping. So that can cause some issues as well as it's just maybe jumping to a target that you don't want to be focusing right now, for example. And that's it. That's a short TLDR about the Moonkin Covenant abilities. I do hope this helped you out a little on which Covenant to choose. Of course, I've only talked about the main abilities, the main Covenant abilities. There's also lots of other smaller abilities like Conduits and Soulbinds that you might want to be looking at that also change the way your druid works, like your utility and other damage buffs that you might want to consider. So definitely look at all of the covenants a little bit more. Make sure you look at the conduits as well, and make sure you familiarize yourself with the covenant before you choose one. And as I said, Venthyr and Night Fae are probably the 2 covenants I would be suggesting to you as it stands right now. Don't feel like you're forced to play Venthyr just because it is the best DPS covenant right now. I definitely don't think that Night Fae is that far behind that you couldn't be picking it at all. So if you like Night Fae a lot better, then make sure you do go with Night Fae, in my opinion. Venthyr, if you really need to min-max your DPS completely, or you don't even mind Venthyr, maybe even like that covenant, then go ahead and go for Venthyr. Kyrian and Necrolord are definitely a little bit more lackluster than the other 2, so just keep that in mind. And as I said, if there's going to be any major changes to this ranking or any major changes to the way Covenant abilities work for Moonkin, I will probably make a new video, so keep an eye out for that. And if there's any minor changes, I will put it in the description below, so make sure you check that out. And thank you so much for watching. I hope I see you at the next video. Bye, guys.